we all know the Ten Commandments, whether we have watched the epic movie starring Charlton Heston, memorized the list in Sunday school, or Vacation Bible School, or some youth group over the years. It's one of those enduring lessons that we have kept all our lives. Most of us know them by heart and can recite them in order. But have they truly made an impact on your life and the way you live? In Zora Neale Hurston's novel called Moses, Man of the Mountain, he writes, Moses lifted the freshly chiseled tablets of stone in his hands and gazed down the mountain to where Israel waited. He knew a great exultation. Now men could be free. They had something of the essence of divinity expressed. They had the chart and compass of behavior. They need not stumble into blind ways and injure themselves. This was bigger than Israel. It comprehended the world. Israel could be a heaven for all people forever, for these sacred stones. With flakes of light still clinging to his face, Moses turned to where Joshua waited for him. Joshua, I have laws. Israel is going to know peace and justice. God has just delivered Israel from bondage, and now God explains what will be required for them to stay free and out of bondage from another nation. There is such a thing as holiness, as a deep desire to fulfill God's will, and it is required of all people. The intent of the commandments is to engender love of God and love of neighbor. As Christians, we find these 10 commandments a set of profound guidelines that demonstrate the kind of life God wants us to live. In doing research and reading for today's sermon, I came across a comment by Father Francis Spirago that the first commandment, thou shalt not have any other gods before me, requires both internal and external worship of God. As a church and people of faith, we've gotten very good at our external worship of God. Some of us have been attending church worship services, publicly claiming God a priority in our lives for most of those years. So our external worship can't be questioned. But what about our internal worship? Again, trying to find some silver lining and some lessons learned from this past year of isolation and being away from our public houses of worship, perhaps this year has taught us the importance of our internal worship of God. How well we place our priorities about our faith when we are alone with God, when we have no external motivations, when that public eye isn't upon us. The second commandment, you shall not make any graven images of God. Yet we are made in God's image. And Jesus, both fully human and fully God, is the perfect image of God. Any other creature-like images, the Egyptian god of Horus, or the Wall Street golden bull, you name it, they mislead us. Martin Luther clarified this commandment when he said that our God is whatever motivates us, changes our mood, embodies the life that we desire. So, who is your God? The third commandment is you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. But what exactly does that mean? No swearing with God's name in it? Not exactly. More accurately, it means that every utterance of God's name should be done so with reverence. A mixture of awe and wonder, love, respect, and esteem. Evoking the name of God should not be for casual purposes. Imagine a being so powerful, so perfect, so incredibly beyond human understanding that the very foundations of the universe hang from the palm of his hand. God spins the whirling planets, too numerous that we do not even know the extent of them. There are billions of them. God created all of them from nothing. God knows the very number of hairs upon your head and upon the head of every living creature that has ever stepped foot upon the earth. the number of scales of every fish in the sea, the number of feathers on every bird that has soared the skies. God knows every leaf that has unfurled from the tiniest bud, every root that has stretched its length into the earth, and every flower that has scented the air. God knows every living creature by name. God preserves and guides them. God hears our prayers, helps us in our necessities of life, rewards or disciplines us as is our need, and provides good things for our heart's desires. So when we utter God's name, we need to do so with reverence and awe. On Mount Sinai, God spoke to Moses and gave a rather long explanation for the next commandment. Remember the Sabbath day and to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all of your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son or daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or even the alien resident in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and the sea and all that is in them, but rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. Now, over the years, we've sort of misconstrued this commandment. Generations of our parents and grandparents seem to think that this meant stores should be closed on Sunday and people shouldn't go to work that day. Which I suppose in small towns and villages, that worked as a general guideline for everyone in the town or in the village to be on the same schedule. But mostly, we don't live in small towns anymore. We live in a global village now, which is much more difficult for all of us to have that same schedule. For example, those of us who come from large families, even you know how difficult it can be for everyone to be on the same schedule, to sit down at all meals together, to go to work or school at the same time, to have the same vacation periods, etc. It's difficult, if not impossible. I remember comments by my grandmother who would say things like, I don't know what the world is coming to. I remember when all the stores used to be closed on Sunday. But this commandment wasn't primarily a prescription for how retail stores were or were not to operate. It was primarily about our own internal rest and time of meditation for our reverence for God. We've sort of forgotten the primary purpose and instead have focused on the secondary purpose. Yes, in the secondary purpose, we are to give time of rest to people in our sphere of influence, whether they're family members or people in our employ, and to make sure that they too have a time of rest just like ourselves, a time for contemplation on the blessings given to them by God, a time of meditation and worship. But that is the primary purpose. And we are all to remember a day of Sabbath. In the fifth commandment, there's a major shift from the first through the fourth commandments that have a primary focus on God to that of others. This fifth commandment can be difficult for those who have had abusive parents. But this commandment is as much about parents as it is about children. Honor thy father and mother. In the third commandment, we saw the majesty and faithfulness of God toward God's own creation, and why we as God's own children ought to be reverent to God. God requires of us this reverence because God cares for us deeply, provides for us, cherishes us, rewards and disciplines us, and knows our every need. This is equally true of this fifth commandment. Parents, as ambassadors for God, as earthly representatives of God, should do the very same thing for their children, and thus are due the respect and honor that we give to God. Our parents should be our greatest benefactors. Ambrose, Bishop of Milan, had a huge influence over Augustine's life. And upon Augustine's confession of his disrespect and treatment of his parents, Bishop Ambrose said to him, "How much has not your mother suffered on your account? How many sleepless nights? How many privations? How much anxiety has she not borne for you? how hard your father has worked to provide you with food and raiment. And can you be so ungrateful to those who have done and suffered so much for you? Now, if you know anything about Augustine and his life, you would know that his parents weren't perfect parents, by far. Although Augustine lived during the 1st century, his family wasn't much different than any other family today. And as he got older and sought to be more faithful to God, he realized his own contempt toward his parents was a disrespect of God. And he sought to confess that sin and to soften his attitude toward them. In keeping faith with this commandment, may it be one that we hold dear as both parents and children. Parents, earn the respect and honor of your children. And children, give your due honor to them as God's earthly representatives. Now, in the 6th through the 10th commandments, attention is turned fully outward on our relationships with the world around us and our duties to each other. Don't kill. How many times do the characters of the Old Testament get in trouble with God over this one? God sought out Cain when he killed his brother Abel. Nathan condemned David for having Bathsheba's husband killed. But that isn't all. In the Gospels, Jesus explains that anger is an interior kind of murder. And in our rancorous culture, where anger management is a big thing, aren't we rabid killers? No adultery. In a culture where sex as impulse, pleasure, self-fulfillment is all over the media, Jesus said, if you harbor lust in your heart, you are an adulterer. There is a reminder, however, in this commandment that in an encounter that Jesus has with a group of men who are about to stone a woman to death for being an adulterer. Jesus tells the men that if they are without sin, they can throw the first stone. And one by one, they drop their stones and wander off. And Jesus offers her forgiveness. So even if we've broken these laws and sinned, we are reminded that there is forgiveness. No stealing. Again, in doing some reading and research for today's sermon, I found some interesting takes on this commandment. Francis Sparago says that all trustworthy information respecting the earliest ages of humanity bears evidence to the possession of personal property. If those living in a society, as a group, would not have the right of possession, the incentive to labor would be wanting. And this is an argument, in its various forms, for those who are against government handouts or providing charity. There is therefore no incentive to labor for your possessions, because then you can either steal it, if there's no law against that, from another, or it's given to you as a reward for being slothful. But Sparago goes on to explain more. But it cannot be said that the distribution of wealth, as it is under existing circumstances, is in accordance with the will of God. It could not be God's will that a small minority should enjoy all the world's wealth, while an overwhelming majority of God's children should live in poverty and destitution. This great inequality is the result of sin. So, although on the surface this commandment to don't steal seems easy enough to interpret, there is a multi-tiered level in our manifestation of this commandment today. Do not lie. This one can be called the commandment of the tongue, the mind, and the heart. Being truthful in all things is not always easy. We sometimes even justify our little white lies. But this is honestly a much deeper commandment. It's about the truth that we tell ourselves and the mirage of a false narrative to hurt someone else. Perhaps it can be summed up by the words of Polonius in Shakespeare's play Hamlet. To thine own self be true. But what does that mean? The first meaning is that someone can better judge him or herself if they have done what they should or could have done. The second is that a person should be honest in all their ways and their relations. The third meaning is that a person must always do the right thing. And finally, Polonius, who was speaking to his son at the time, meant that he must do whatever was most beneficial in an honest, upright way. And finally, we come to the last commandment: no coveting. Coveting is the engine of capitalism, however, wanting all the toys. But I think God would liberate us from the stranglehold of always wanting more, or really, wanting what is new and different. An example of covetousness today might not be wanting more iPhones, but rather wanting the latest iPhone, the latest toy and gadget. These are the enduring laws of God that have lasted for thousands of years. May we still find them relevant today. Thanks be to God. Amen.